Right. You know what's interesting to me is that I was so just so that people have a little more context, because I usually provide the description for who I'm talking to. I give an introduction so people have an idea why I'm talking to this person. But you have a very unique presence, and I'm going to stop at unique because the word's ambiguous enough for us to dig into and actually find out what this uniqueness is made out of on Twitter. So I was surfing through your Twitter yesterday, and there was
All right.
something about an acknowledgement of the fact that Singapore, in some sense, had not lived up to its expectation in terms of handling the virus situation vis-a-vis migrant workers, right? And
Yeah.
and to me, and to not just me, but to somebody who studies economics, and Singapore is cited as the model of development in so many senses, right? Where it's like, from the outside, it looks like Singapore has got it figured out in so many ways. I'm curious, what is this dissonance? What is really happening? Why are there two separate, pictures that I'm getting from the inside and the outside?
I guess it depends on your frame of reference. So the thing you have to understand about Singapore is that, again, and it's always slightly awkward to talk about these things because Singapore is where I was born and raised and spent the vast majority of my life. So it is my primary frame of reference. So I'm used to things, I take for granted things that Singaporeans take for granted, which is that we expect everything to just work. We expect, and I mean,
how lucky.
The thing is, there are trade-offs.
Right,
so people will say Singapore is a very strict country. We have drug laws. We have there's pros and cons, and people don't if they've only ever lived in Singapore, they don't really have context for what they are missing out on, for example. And also, I'm thinking now about how when I visited San Francisco last year, I was kind of astounded / shocked. Well, I mean, I was told to expect it, so it wasn't a complete shock. But like their trains, the Bay Area Rapid the BART, it's just, to a Singaporean, it just seems like unconscionably poorly run. Like it's like, I mean, it's like California itself is would be one of the richest countries in the world if it was a country. But, the culture is different, and, they have more of a car culture, I guess, and they don't prioritize public transport and public works and stuff like that. And anyway, so you were asking about migrant workers. Yeah. So Singapore is built by migrant workers, basically, right? From the very beginning, from even before independence. And again, we are probably not the worst in the world at it. There's other countries that have even more terrible
migrant worker situations. Yes, I acknowledge.
But that, like, it's, I mean, you can get kind of philosophical about it. It's like, whatever your conditions are in life, as an individual, let's say, right? Like, you will always be sensitive to what you are doing wrong or what is not working out for you. So, I remember when I was a teenager, I was stressed about, will anybody ever hire me? Will I ever get a job? Will I ever have an audience? Right. And then I started work, and I got like I got a dream job, or like a job that was beyond my wildest dreams. It was a great work environment. It was, I respected my boss. The work I was doing was interesting and fun. And I remember at some point I was like stressed about work. I was like upset, like, because I was struggling with some content that I was trying to produce. And I remember thinking to myself, like, I was feeling sorry for myself. I was like, oh my God, fuck my life. Like, this work is so difficult. And then I got like whiplash, like, what the fuck? Like, why? Like a year ago, like I would have been extremely happy to have the job that I have now. Right. But like once you get it, you start to take for granted all of the good things, and then you start to notice all of the bad things. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because there's always room for improvement. There's always, so it is with, I guess, like our migrant worker situation. And it's easy for a citizen to say, oh, our migrant worker problem is not that bad, or right, like I'm not the one living in the dorms that are overcrowded, and you will hear from everyday Singaporeans saying things like, oh, but the migrant workers, they made a choice to come here, and they're doing it because working here is better than trying to make it back home. And when they save up money here and they move back, they're going to have a higher standard of living. That's true. But also, it's like, there's the sense of what is the social contract in the city that you live, where if the average citizen is relatively so prosperous compared to most of the world, then is it fair that we are paying them what we are paying them? Is it we say things like, oh, market forces, right? But it's still, the disparity is still visible, and I think it's something that we have to think about, and so we want to work on it, and we always want to have a better, like, we can always be better, and so we should always be trying to be better.
Right. I think one of the most interesting things that I read off Twitter while the whole coronavirus narrative became the focus of Twitter, which I will admit now is no longer the case, was the true legacy of coronavirus is not work from home, it's class consciousness. And part of it resonated with me in the sense where for the first time ever, the haves and the have-nots had the clearest, most undeniable life and death distinction as far as migrant workers in India were concerned, right? And I'm not sure how much you kept up with that, but it was pretty horrible, right? But what you mentioned was super interesting to me, this acquisition of this reacquiring a baseline over and over. I keep adjusting and adapting to a new baseline. It's called hedonic adaptation, right? And I wonder, because here is the deal. When I sit across from a friend of mine who's born and brought up in China, and when I sit across from a friend of mine who's born and brought up in America, two of the most, let's say, polar opposite concepts of freedom in some sense, I realize both of them function pretty fine. In fact, they might prefer some things that the other person does not prefer about them. So like my Chinese friend might prefer the fact that XYZ ABC, which my American friend would not like in my Chinese friend. The general idea being, including the trade-offs, the net balance of living in Singapore. Is that something you'd be like, like I remember you cannot throw chewing gums or chew chewing gums in Singapore as far as the law is.
So it's illegal to sell it. So you can't buy it anywhere in Singapore itself. But like if you buy it in Malaysia, let's say you buy like enough for personal consumption, you can bring it into Singapore and that. So it's not. I mean, I find that the international reporting on that tends to be a bit alarmist. Like they make it out to be way crazier than it actually is. But it is a thing. Like there's restrictions.
So these aggressive laws, in whichever direction, innocuous or not, that exist, plus this marvelous efficiency and scale of doing things, is that a net trade-off you're happy with, or is that a net trade-off you'd be like, because I can imagine an American being like, you know what, I care about my freedom more. You see what I mean? What do you think about Singapore as a net?
I mean, so it's funny that we're talking about this right now, because right now there's widespread protests in the States and there's curfews, and we don't have that in Singapore. So but it would be almost too easy for me to say, aha, look, this is how Singapore is better than the States. Like, being Singaporean and participating in the international community, you get every year or so you get a new article in the American media or whatever about, oh, Singapore is so sterile, it's so authoritarian. They have this, like, we are like this bogeyman in a way for them. And so it's very, very tempting to fight back and to strike back and say, you know what, like, we're doing fine and you guys are suffering. So, who's really up and down? Right. But at the same time, there are other variables to consider. So I think the biggest variable that people almost always underestimate is literally size. So Singapore is it's an island city state. It's a whole country is a city and it's a state. It's a small thing. So we don't have, like city government and then federal government. It's all the same government. And that is easier to manage in a lot of ways. And there are also certain things that other people who live in bigger countries may not appreciate. So, every Singaporean male does national service, which is either you serve in the military or the police or the civil defense, which is, fire engine and all that stuff. And, as a Singaporean male, I'm proud to have served, and so you'll get different opinions from people about that, whether or not it's acceptable. Right. But
that's the case for Israel as well. Like Israel, Korean, all of them have an opinion, but they do it regardless.
That's true. Yeah. And I mean, you can't really not do it by choice. I mean, I think in Israel, you can be a dissenter and then you go to
You can be
prison instead.
religious. You can be religious and
Yeah.
then let it be.
Yeah. But then I think there's still, you still have to spend time in something. I'm not sure about the specifics. But so that is a big difference between large countries and small ones.
Mhm.
And having my sense of perspective, I feel that it's probably healthier to live in a smaller country. And I think, if you look at like very large countries like China, America, India, and then you look at smaller countries in Europe or I guess mainly I'm thinking of Europe. I'm not so sure.
And East Asia, like, South Korea is one example.
Yeah,
I can't. Singapore, I'd count them. Yeah.
Yeah, so there are things about living in a large country and especially if it's not a homogenous country.
Mhm.
So China is a bit more homogenous. Although even then, if you get into the details, there's like some details about how they manage their minorities in the situation there, which I'm not qualified to talk about that, but it's messy and ugly.
Yes.
Indonesia is another very large country that has, knowing what I know, I think I would prefer to be a citizen of a small country. I think it gives you a more grounded perspective on life even, which isn't to say that you can't be grounded living in a large country, but I think being in a large country and seeing what's happening in politics in the States, and I think politics in India as well, I think there's something about like when the country is so large, you don't really know what's going on at the other part of the country, right? So Singapore is so small, you can walk across the country in a day. Like you can survey the whole country. You basically know everyone. Like so even when people say things like Singapore is so authoritarian, it's like, yeah, but you have to understand that it's like we all have friends in government. We all have friends in all of the ministries. It's not disconnected. It's not some federal government like thousands of miles away. And so it's a lot more intimate. And again, I think that's healthier. Just imagine like working in a small company of like 10, 20 people versus working in a company with like 5,000 people. It's a different relationship.
Right.
Some people prefer that in the large company, it's more anonymous. You don't really need to like know what's going on. You can kind of like ignore stuff and everything's fine. And some people prefer that.
Right.
I have a bias for preferring a small country where, so if I feel that there's something not right in Singapore, I can have a pretty high confidence of being able to, I could write a blog post potentially or whatever. I can get a message out to most of the rest of my country in a fairly short amount of time, which gives me a sense of belonging, a sense of participation, which I sense that a lot of my American friends, and I think quite a lot of my Indian friends as well, they don't feel like they have that. It's like your political opponents or like the other tribe is like this way. It's almost like this phantom hallucination kind of thing. And so the media has much more influence in controlling the narrative and in selection bias and all those things. I think there's this TED talk by Benjamin Barber, if I'm getting his name right. He argues that nation states. So there used to be empires, right? And empires are no longer a thing because after World War I and II, there was the whatever agreements, the treaties that were signed, and just everyone just came around to saying empires don't make sense, nation states make more sense. And the argument is that nation states too are kind of like an interim solution. Like it's like an in between state. And the one thing the argument is that, but cities have endured for thousands of years, regardless of what empire comes in or goes out, who's the conqueror, who's the king, whether at one point there's a Roman Empire, one point that's not. But the city of Milan, the city of Pisa, the city of Delhi, right? These cities have histories and they have culture and whatever. And it's more natural for humans to be involved in that local kind of sphere.
Right.
And so in that kind of grand scheme of things, I think city-states are healthier but again, when I say that, I wonder if, I'm speaking from a point of view of like, based on my history, right? Which is during my lifetime, there hasn't been a world war, right? And when there is a world war, like, you don't want to be a small city when there is an empire at your doorstep, right? So that's when things can be terrible. So it's very conditional, it's very contextual.
But
But
I think you are onto something with the idea that the nation state concept is battling more than one problem at once, right? It is battling a problem with the outside world, and it is battling a problem with the inside world, and that equilibrium is extremely difficult to find. And therefore, I mean, it's almost kind of instinctively weird to me when people begin to say, quote unquote, rate countries. Is Singapore better than America? Because you have to understand that on a two-dimensional graph, they are two different points of equilibrium, right? It's not like they could be represented on a linear scale. I'm not even sure if a two-way graph would do justice to representing the kind of variables that must be represented in a question like that. And I think the whole commentary you brought up about how intimate your community, Singapore as a country can be, the idea is so foreign to me from coming from India, just immensely foreign to me. And I don't know, do you follow Nassim Taleb or Joe Norman? Have you been listening to their commentary on localism? Does that resonate with the kind of model that Singapore already organically sort of has?
Yeah, so I'm familiar with Taleb's work, and I've seen what he's written about Singapore. And so he points out that Singapore's closest neighbor is Malaysia, which is just north of Singapore.
Right.
And he points out that even Singapore and Malaysia, even though they're neighbors, you can't really compare them because Malaysia has like 50 cities, 100 cities. I'm not even sure how many cities. It has like 14 states, I think, or 16, and they have different cities. So it probably is the case that Singapore should be thought of as a city, and cities you can compare cities to other cities. So what's it like in Singapore versus Delhi versus London versus New York versus San Francisco? So each city has its own set of values and principles and whatnot. And so, with having said all of that preamble, the core question that you're asking was, do I think Singapore's trade-offs are kind of good? I love my country, but I'm not satisfied with it. I think we have I think we've come a very long way. I think we made the best of what we inherited. And I think, Singapore, and even between cities, there are many different kinds of cities. And there are like very, very old cities that have a ton of history. So Singapore, I would describe Singapore as a maritime city. And what I mean by that is a city with travel and trade that is deeply intertwined with the country's history and so it's an immigrant population, right? Which isn't true for every single city in the world. Like some cities have, I think, so Taleb has talked about how some of the Mediterranean countries, the people in the Levant or whatever, they've been there for thousands of years, right? And their culture is that old. And Singapore doesn't have that. I mean, so this is one of the things that I am personally passionate about. I feel like Singapore as a concept, as an idea, we have changed our national concept a few times in the past couple of 100 years. And, when after independence, after separation from Malaysia in 1965, there was this narrative of kind of fragility and like, we don't have an army, we just got kicked out of a bigger country, we're not going to survive, we need to be desperate times, desperate measures, we have to really kind of, we don't have a history, we have to build everything from scratch. And that worked out for like 50 years. But I think the value of that narrative, so I think that narrative was kind of, it was deliberately constructed for that purpose of kind of building the nation in that short period of time in like an emergency context. Right. But it doesn't have like lasting power over centuries, right? And one of the kind of troubling things if you study city-states, Venice and all those countries, is that city-states don't tend to last more than a couple of 100 years or so. Like it's historically, it doesn't quite work out that way. I mean, in that it's a country. And I think for Singapore's ongoing future, I think we have to dig deeper into kind of what the story of the country is, and we have to redefine that for ourselves. And how I'm approaching it is that, again, like, so Singapore has been around. So the island has been around forever, obviously. And it has, if you dig back into 400, 800 years of history, it was once a part of like the Indonesian, like maritime empires. It was part of the Srivijaya Empire. It's part of the Majapahit. Majapahit Empire, and it was it was just a valuable trading port in a maritime space, and that changes. Who's in charge? Who's the king? That changes from time to time. But the point is that there are always merchants and travelers coming by on ships. So now we have, it's the year 2020, and we have planes. Well, right now there are no planes flying because of COVID, but we are in this very interesting position in Southeast Asia between India and China. And I believe that, well, okay, what I haven't said yet is I think a city should have a story. I think, it should have economic opportunity, and it should have a narrative that the people of the city believe in. And I feel like the Singaporean narrative has been great for us up until around now, but it won't continue to last. So we need a more
robust narrative.
A more evocative narrative that people believe in. Because again, 50 years ago, it was like, we have nothing, and if we work really hard, we'll have something. That was enough. And then so now we have something, but we're not like happy. We're kind of like it's like the analogy I've given some people is imagine Singapore is like this nerdy kid that gets bullied in school, right? World War II, right? Get occupied by foreign invaders. So this nerdy kid gets beaten up, pissed on, and then he's like, you know what? Like, I'm gonna work out. I'm gonna study hard. I'm gonna do 100 push-ups every day. I'm not gonna have any fun at all. I'm just gonna focus on my grades, study really hard, get a good job, make a lot of money. And so now you got a good job, you make a lot of money, you're like fit, everything seems great, but you're not happy. You're like, okay, now what? Like, you didn't have time to figure out what your culture is. You didn't have time to figure out what's meaningful to you. It was just getting away from like horror, like this
stress, right.
Yeah. And so now our parents' generation struggled to give us the breathing room to breathe, but they couldn't tell us what we should be dreaming about, right? And dreaming was a luxury that we couldn't afford at the time. Right. But now that we're here, it's like, people are increasingly getting kind of depressed, despondent, kind of, what is it all for? I'm working so hard, I'm making so much money, I got a nice car, a nice handbag, but so what? What's next? And I think what's exciting is that we are seeing, the rise of India and the rise of China, and really a resurgence of Asian influence, power, however you want to put it. Just those billions of people are rising in the world, right? And I feel like Singapore is a very interesting place to. So I guess the question I want to answer is, what would make an ambitious, smart, courage, like just think of like really great people, like just all around great, smart, kind, just wonderful people. What would make them want to come to Singapore and set up their life here? Like, they can go anywhere they want. If they want to go to New York, they can go to New York. If they want to go to San Francisco, London, Moscow, Tokyo, wherever they want to go, they can go. What would make them want to come to Singapore? And I think that's a question that we need to answer. I think we haven't had a good answer in a while. Even now the narrative is like, oh, Singapore's very safe. It's a very safe place to raise your kids. Like, that's not fun. That's not exciting. That's like what? Like, it's like a retirement plan.
Yeah, that's like a backup.
It's not sexy. It's not. People almost apologize when they talk about Singapore. They're like, oh, I'm so sorry that, it's not a lot of fun. It's kind of, but it's safe. The food is good. But like, I want to be able to be like, yo, dude, if you got to come to Singapore, man, this is where the future is happening, right? Like, it's where the culture is going to happen. It's where we are. East meets West. You'll see there's Americans here, there's Chinese people here, Indians here. And like, this is where the best people from the best parts of the world are all gathering here to figure out what the future is. Like, I think that's exciting. That's a cool narrative that you wake up in the morning and like, I can't wait to go out and meet these people and see what they're doing. That's exciting. That's what life should be, I think. And I think Singapore does have. So we're not there yet. There's a bunch of stuff we need to change and fix. Like, some of the old laws are way too, like, it was for a different time. It was, we were recovering from war. We were dealing with communism and whatnot. And, we need more arts. We need more culture. We need more, like, just all of those things. We can do more, but people need leadership. People need other people to look to for guidance, and they need to see people doing crazy, exciting things. And then I think more and more people will come. And that's one of my major life goals, I guess. It's like to make Singapore
great again.
I mean, the way I frame it is we've never had like an intellectual / cultural golden age.
Right.
We had an economic boom, but the economic boom was at the expense of culture in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Like we didn't have there's nobody really says Singaporean artists, Singaporean poets. Now you will hear some people say there's a Singaporean guy on Twitter. There's one guy, right?
Yeah, right.
But
right.
But I want to find all the other cool people and bring them together and put on a show and make people excited. And